Terrorist attacks in Paris last Friday remind us the damage a terrorist organization can do with even a little money. ISIS, however, is the richest terrorist organization in history. Last year alone, ISIS made over $1 billion. That's more money than some countries make in a year. Much of that money was made from seizing state assets, selling oil on the black market, and taxing people living in its so-called caliphate. Those sources of money are mostly internal and do not use the international financial system. But other sources of funding are more dependent on the outside world and may be easier to cut off. For example, ISIS made nearly $50 million last year from kidnapping for ransom. Some estimates put kidnapping for ransom as high as 20% of ISIS's revenue. ISIS is not the only terrorist group kidnapping hostages to make money. AQIM is said to rely almost exclusively on kidnapping for ransom for funds. This is the same terrorist group that attacked a gas plant in Algeria and killed one of my constituents, Victor Lovelady, after taking him hostage. From 2008 to 2014, terrorist groups made roughly $165 million from ransom payments. To try and stop this wave of payments in the last 2 years, the United Nations passed 3 Security Council resolutions condemning the payment of ransoms to terrorists. Our own country has a long history of countering this barbaric practice. From the very beginning, the United States has always refused to pay ransom to terrorists. Barbary pirates captured American merchant ships and demanded ransoms to release the crews in the early 1800s. Even then, President Thomas Jefferson refused to pay the bounty. Jefferson argued that doing so would only encourage more attacks. Throughout history, terrorists have learned to demand ransoms from those who will pay. I also want to recognize that this issue can be complex. We have the mother of James Foley here with us today. Mrs. Foley, I want to express my condolences to you for the loss of your son. I think it's important that we hear from family members of those who are kidnapped, so I appreciate, and the committee appreciates the fact that you were willing to testify. Terrorist groups have long depended on criminal activity. Can someone shut the door? Thank you. Terrorist groups have long depended on criminal activity for funding, including trafficking of cultural antiquities. ISIS is currently in control of hundreds of sites throughout Syria and Iraq. These sites are the cultural heritage of humanity, but ISIS sees them as a financial opportunity. Declassified ISIS documents show that the terrorists made hundreds of millions of dollars from selling these antiquities. According to some estimates, antiquities smuggling at one point was ISIS's second largest source of funding. ISIS is killing people with the money it makes from these artifacts while also destroying history. Believe it or not, there are some people who voluntarily give their money to these murderers. ISIS has maintained connections with wealthy donors for nearly a decade. Many of these donors are based in Gulf countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Between 2013 and 2014, ISIS received as much as $40 million from these wealthy benefactors. And ISIS is not the only terrorist group benefiting from these deep-pocket donors who give money to terrorist groups. Wealthy individuals from these countries fund terrorists all over the world, including Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. They set up charities and funnel the money directly to the terrorists. The government of these Gulf countries simply do not do enough to stop the steady stream of terrorist financing that seems to start from a handful of Middle Eastern countries. These private donors are just as guilty as the terrorists. Unless more is done, the governments of these countries are complicit in the crimes. These 3 sources of terrorist funding have given ISIS hundreds of millions of dollars in the last year. Cutting off even one of these sources could make a big difference. ISIS thrives off the appearance that it is winning. By cutting even a portion of ISIS's funds, we can challenge its narrative of victory. That will mean not only less money for the terrorists, but also possibly less recruits. More importantly, it would mean less victims of ISIS's barbaric terrorist attacks. We must use all the resources at our disposal to target every source of terrorist funding, no matter where it comes from.